It is December 8, 1941, less than 24 hours after Japanese aircraft turned the harbor of Pearl Harbor into a graveyard of twisted steel and burning oil. A nation that had spent years refusing to look at the war now looked directly into its face. President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress and spoke 12 words that would permanently alter the trajectory of human civilization. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. In those 12 words, something was activated that the world had never seen before. Not just a military declaration, not just a political statement. The activation of an industrial, technological, and human engine of destruction so vast, so precise, and so overwhelming that it would compress what should have been decades of military development into less than 4 years. Within 72 hours of that speech, the United States had declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy simultaneously. Within 6 months, American factories that had been building automobiles were building tanks, bombers, and artillery at rates that their enemies could not calculate without disbelief. Within 4 years, the United States had not just entered the war, it had fundamentally changed what war was. This is not a story about battles. This is a story about the most concentrated mobilization of military power in the history of the human race. This is the story of how America built its war machine and how that machine broke the world in half. To understand what America built between 1941 and 1945, you first need to understand what the world looked like before it was built. In September 1939, when Germany's Wehrmacht rolled into Poland with 2,500 tanks and nearly 2,000 aircraft in a blitzkrieg that shattered one of Europe's largest armies in less than 5 weeks, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world by size, smaller than Romania's, smaller than Portugal's, equipped with obsolete weapons and dependent on horses for much of its logistics. The American military in 1939 was not a global power. It was a relic, a peacetime institution designed for a world that no longer existed. The U.S. Army Air Corps had fewer than 2,500 aircraft, most of them obsolete. The Navy, while larger, was configured for defensive operations in the Western Hemisphere, not for simultaneous combat across 2 oceanic theaters against 2 of the most powerful naval forces in the world. The Marine Corps numbered fewer than 20,000 men, the entire combined military strength of the United States in 1939. Could not have held a single front against the German military machine that had already consumed Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in less than a year of combat operations. What happened between December 1941 and September 1945 was not simply military preparation. It was the fastest and most complete transformation of an economy and society into a war machine that has ever occurred in the history of organized human conflict. And the scale of what was built, what was produced, what was deployed, and what was destroyed still challenges comprehension more than 80 years later. The foundation of American military power in the Second World War was not courage, not strategy, and not individual heroism, though all of those existed in abundance. The foundation was production. Raw, relentless, mathematically staggering industrial production at a scale that no adversary could match, sustain, or even accurately measure. When the War Production Board was established in January 1942, its mandate was simple and absolute: convert the American economy to war production immediately and completely. The results were unlike anything industrial civilization had previously achieved. Before December 7, 1941, American factories produced approximately 3 million automobiles per year, the largest automotive output in the world. After the War Production Board issued its directive, civilian automobile production was halted. In all of 1942, 1943, 1944, and 1945 combined, Fewer than 140 civilian automobiles were manufactured in the United States. Every assembly line, every tool and die shop, every steel mill, every aluminum smelter, every rubber plant was redirected toward a single purpose: the production of weapons. General Motors, which had built Chevrolets and Buicks and Cadillacs, began building tanks, aircraft engines, machine guns, cannons, and naval ammunition. Ford Motor Company, which had perfected the moving assembly line for consumer vehicles, applied that same principle to the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber at its Willow Run facility in Michigan, eventually producing one completed four-engine bomber every 63 minutes. Chrysler built tanks. The Pullman Railcar Company built artillery shells. The Remington Typewriter Company built rifles. The industrial capacity of the most productive economy on Earth was transformed, virtually overnight, from peace to war, and the output that followed was unlike anything the world had seen before or has seen since. The numbers themselves are almost incomprehensible when examined together. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 300,000 military aircraft, more than Germany and Japan combined across the entire war. It produced 86,000 tanks, enough to have equipped every armored division that fought on every front of the entire war from every nation combined, and still had thousands remaining. It produced 2.4 million military trucks, vehicles that fed, supplied, and moved armies across continents. It built 8,800 naval vessels of all classes, from aircraft carriers to PT boats. It manufactured nearly 3 million machine guns, 12 million rifles, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. It produced more steel in a single year than Germany produced across the entire war. And it did all of this while simultaneously feeding its own civilian population, supplying its allies through the Lend-Lease program, which sent 17.5 million tons of military equipment to Great Britain and the Soviet Union, and financing the entire effort without reducing the standard of living of its civilian population below pre-war levels. By 1944, the United States was producing more war material than all of its enemies combined. Not slightly more, not marginally more. More than all of them, Germany, Japan, Italy, and their client states combined. This was not military superiority. This was military dominance of a kind that had no precedent in the industrial age. To understand where that production came from, you need to understand what American industry actually was in 1941 and what it was capable of when given a single, unified purpose. The United States in 1941 possessed the largest industrial base in the world by a margin that has never been equaled before or since relative to global output. American steel production alone exceeded the combined output of Germany and Japan by a factor of more than 3. American coal production powered factories operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, across a continent that no enemy bomber could reach. American oil fields in Texas, Oklahoma, California, and the Gulf of Mexico produced 67% of the world's petroleum, the blood of mechanized warfare. The railroads that connected American production facilities to American ports moved more freight in a single month than the entire German logistics system managed in a year on the Eastern Front. And beneath all of this was a workforce that, when the men went to war, was supplemented by the entry of nearly 20 million women into the industrial labor force. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter was not a symbol, it was a fact. Women built bombers, women assembled tanks, women manufactured the ammunition that American soldiers, sailors, and airmen used to destroy the Axis powers. Approximately 260,000 women directly manufactured weapons and military equipment. Without them, the production numbers that won the war were impossible. The American war machine was not built by generals. It was built by workers, millions of them operating at maximum capacity, sustained by a society that had decided with absolute finality that it would not lose. Among the companies that defined what American industrial power meant in the context of the Second World War, Ford Motor Company stands as perhaps the single most extraordinary example. Henry Ford had already transformed manufacturing with the moving assembly line in 1913. His engineers applied that same principle to the largest, most complex manufacturing challenge in the history of American industry, the mass production of the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. The Willow Run plant, built on farmland outside Ypsilanti, Michigan, was itself a statement of intent. At its completion, the factory building covered over 1 million square feet, the largest enclosed factory floor in the world at the time. Inside that building, Ford's engineers designed a production system of breathtaking complexity and precision. The B-24 had 488,193 individual parts. Every rivet, every control surface, every fuel line, every piece of wiring had to be manufactured to exact tolerances, assembled in precise sequence, tested, and integrated into a flying machine capable of delivering 10 tons of bombs from an altitude of 25,000 feet to targets 2,000 miles away. At peak production in 1944, Willow Run was completing one B-24 every 63 minutes, 650 aircraft per month from a single factory. By the end of the war, Ford had built 6,792 B-24 Liberators at Willow Run, in addition to producing bomber components for assembly at other facilities. This single factory, operated by a workforce that had largely never seen a military aircraft before 1941, produced more heavy bombers than the entire aircraft industry of Japan managed across the entire course of the war. The B-24 itself would fly more combat missions than any other American aircraft of the war. 226,775 sorties, dropping over 634,000 tons of bombs on Axis targets from North Africa to the Pacific. The Willow Run factory and the bomber it built are, in purely quantitative terms, among the most significant military-industrial achievements in human history. The story of American armor, of how the United States built the tank force that helped crush the Wehrmacht, is not a story of technological supremacy. It is a story of industrial volume applied with strategic intelligence. The American M4 Sherman tank was not the best tank of the Second World War. The German Tiger I was more heavily armored. The Soviet T-34 had superior mobility. The Sherman was outclassed by German heavy armor in virtually every direct technical comparison. But the Sherman was produced in quantities that rendered those individual technical disadvantages irrelevant at the operational level. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built 49,234 Sherman tanks, a number that exceeded the total tank production of Germany across the entire war by a factor of more than 2. When a Sherman was destroyed by a Tiger, 4 more Shermans were already on their way to replace it. When a German armored division was reduced to combat ineffectiveness by attrition, there was no reserve force of comparable quality to replace it because the German industrial system was incapable of building one fast enough. The American system was. This was the fundamental strategic reality of armored warfare on the Western Front. Not that American tanks were individually superior, but that the American industrial system could replace losses at rates that German production simply could not match. General Motors produced thousands of Sherman hulls. Chrysler engineered and built the tank's turret systems. Numerous other manufacturers supplied the engines, the guns, the fire control systems, and the armor plate. The Sherman tank was, in its most accurate description, not a single product. It was the combined output of an entire industrial ecosystem directed toward a single military purpose. If the land war belonged to factories, the air war belonged to factories and engineers in equal measure, and the American aviation industry in the Second World War produced not just aircraft, but entire new dimensions of what air power meant strategically. The B-17 Flying Fortress, produced primarily by Boeing in Seattle, became the iconic symbol of American strategic bombing in the European theater. Heavy, reliable, capable of absorbing extraordinary punishment and returning its crew home, the B-17 was the foundation of the 8th Air Force's daylight precision bombing campaign that systematically dismantled the industrial infrastructure of the Third Reich between 1941 and 1945. Boeing and its partner manufacturers built 12,731 B-17s. The aircraft flew 291,508 combat sorties over Europe, dropped 640,036 tons of bombs, and was responsible for degrading German oil production, aircraft production, transportation networks, and military industrial output to levels from which the German war economy never recovered. But the B-17 was only one component of the American strategic bombing architecture. The B-24 Liberator from Ford's Willow Run provided the volume for raids that required overwhelming numbers, and the B-29 Superfortress, a technological achievement that represented the absolute cutting edge of aeronautical engineering in 1944, was the instrument that ultimately delivered the weapons that ended the Pacific War. The B-29 was the most expensive weapons development program in American history up to that point, more expensive than the Manhattan Project when development costs are compared. It flew higher, farther, and carried more payload than any bomber that had ever been built. And it was produced in sufficient numbers to conduct the sustained strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home. Islands that reduced Japan's industrial output by 60% before a single atomic weapon was used. The naval dimension of American military power in the Second World War is, if anything, even more staggering than the land and air components, because the United States was not simply rebuilding a navy after Pearl Harbor. It was building the largest navy in the history of the world, from the keel up, at speeds that its adversaries could not begin to match. On December 7, 1941, the United States Navy had 790 vessels of all types in service. By September 2, 1945, the date of Japan's formal surrender, the U.S. Navy had grown to 6,768 vessels. In less than 4 years, the United States built nearly 6,000 warships, aircraft carriers, the weapons that Pearl Harbor had accidentally preserved by keeping them at sea on December 7th, were produced at a rate that shattered all precedent. Before the war, the Navy had 7 fleet carriers. By the war's end, the Essex class alone had contributed 24 fleet carriers to the fleet, each one displacing 27,000 tons, capable of operating 90 aircraft, and representing an investment of nearly $80,001,943. Alongside the fleet carriers came escort carriers, smaller, faster to build, intended to protect convoys and support amphibious operations. The United States built 151 escort carriers during the war. 151. Japan, by comparison, built 17 across the entire war. Destroyers, the workhorses of the fleet, the anti-submarine warfare specialists, the escorts for the carrier task forces, were produced at rates that strained belief. In 1944 alone, American shipyards launched a new destroyer every 11 days. The shipyards of Newport News, Bath Iron Works, Bethlehem Steel, and dozens of other facilities operated around the clock 7 days a week for 4 years without interruption. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War, running from September 1939 to May 1945, and it nearly broke the Allied war effort before American industrial power could be fully brought to bear. German U-boats, operating in coordinated wolf packs guided by the Enigma communications network, sank 2,779 Allied merchant ships during the war, 14.5 million tons of shipping, In 1942 alone, U-boats sank 1,664 vessels in the Atlantic and surrounding waters. If that rate of destruction had been sustained, the flow of American war materials to Britain would have been severed. The British war economy would have been strangled, and the foundation for the liberation of Europe would have been destroyed before it could be built. The answer to this crisis came from American shipyards in the form of the Liberty ship, one of the most consequential industrial achievements of the entire war. The Liberty ship was a simple, functional cargo vessel, designed to be built faster than U-boats could sink them. The first Liberty ship took 244 days to build. American industrial engineers studied that process, identified every inefficiency, redesigned the construction sequence, and began applying the moving assembly line principles that Ford had pioneered to the construction of ocean-going vessels. By 1943, American shipyards were completing a new Liberty ship every 42 hours. The record, set by the Richmond shipyard in California in November 1942, was 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes from keel laying to launching, for a fully functional 14,000-ton ocean-going cargo ship. Across the war, American shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships. The U-boats could not sink them as fast as they were built. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not in the North Atlantic, but in the shipyards of Baltimore, Richmond, and Portland, Maine. No examination of American military power in the Second World War can proceed without confronting the human dimension. The men and women who took the weapons the factories produced and used them. The United States mobilized 16.1 million men and women for military service between 1941 and 1945. 12 million of them served in the Army, 4 million in the Navy, nearly 700,000 in the Marine Corps. These were, with very few exceptions, not professional soldiers. They were farmers, factory workers, students, teachers, mechanics, and clerks who had been civilians in 1940 and were combat veterans by 1943. The speed with which the United States converted this civilian population into effective military force was itself an extraordinary organizational achievement. Basic training programs that had previously taken months were compressed, streamlined, and mass-produced with the same efficiency that characterized American industrial production. Officer candidate schools produced junior officers in 90 days. Army Air Forces. Pilot training programs took civilian men who had never flown an aircraft and produced combat-ready fighter pilots in 6 months. The logistical system that fed, equipped, transported, and supplied these 16 million people across 2 hemispheres and 3 major theaters of war was the largest logistics operation in human history. American soldiers in the European theater consumed 700 tons of supplies per day per division. Moving those supplies from American factories to American ports to British harbors to European railheads to frontline units across France and Germany required a logistics chain of staggering complexity, and it functioned, day after day, with a reliability that the Wehrmacht's logistics system could not match. The American fighter aircraft program of the Second World War produced in the P-51 Mustang, one of the most strategically significant aircraft ever built, and the story of how that aircraft came to exist and what it achieved is inseparable from the story of American industrial and technological power in the war. In late 1942 and early 1943, the 8th Air Force's daylight strategic bombing campaign over Germany was failing. The B-17s and B-24s were suffering catastrophic losses on unescorted missions deep into German territory, losses that threatened to make sustained strategic bombing operationally impossible. On the mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, 60 of 291 attacking B-17s were shot down, a 20% loss rate in a single mission. At those rates, a bomber crew member had a statistical life expectancy of 5 missions before being killed or captured. The B-17s and B-24s were suffering catastrophic losses on unescorted missions deep into German territory, losses that threatened to make sustained strategic bombing operationally impossible. On the mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, 60 of 291 attacking B-17s were shot down, a 20% loss rate in a single mission. At those rates, a bomber crew member had a statistical life expectancy of 5 missions before being killed or captured. The problem was range. No existing Allied fighter could escort the bombers all the way to their targets in Germany and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the Spitfire were outstanding fighters. Their range was limited to the German border at best. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with long-range drop tanks, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back minus 1,500 miles round trip. When P-51 escort groups began appearing over the deepest German targets in early 1944, the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace was systematically destroyed. American fighter pilots didn't simply escort the bombers, they hunted the Luftwaffe. They were ordered to seek out and destroy German fighters wherever they could be found, including on German airfields. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had lost effective control of German airspace. German pilots, who had averaged over 1,000 hours of flight training at the war's beginning, were being replaced by pilots with fewer than 100 hours. The P-51 Mustang and the pilots who flew it didn't just protect the bombers, they destroyed the German Air Force as an effective fighting force. The Pacific War presented the United States military with a challenge fundamentally different from the European theater, and the American response demonstrated a dimension of military capability that went beyond industrial production into strategic creativity of the highest order. The Pacific Ocean covers nearly a third of the Earth's surface. Japan's island empire stretched from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the Dutch East Indies in the south, an area larger than the continental United States. Defeating Japan meant projecting military power across thousands of miles of open ocean, seizing hundreds of fortified islands against fanatical defenders who had been told to fight to the last man, and doing so while simultaneously sustaining a massive ground and air war in Europe. The American answer was the amphibious assault, a form of warfare that the United States essentially invented, refined, and perfected between 1942 and 1945. The techniques, the equipment, the doctrine, and the organizational structure for projecting Army and Marine Corps combat power across defended beaches in the Pacific Theater were developed almost entirely during the war itself, under combat conditions against an enemy that used every defensive innovation available to maximize American casualties. The specialized landing craft that made amphibious operations possible, the LCVP, the LCT, the LST, were designed and built in American shipyards at rates that beggar description. The United States built 35,000 landing craft during the war, 35,000 individual vessels whose sole purpose was to carry American soldiers and Marines from offshore transport ships to defended beaches under fire. No other nation in the history of warfare has mounted amphibious operations of comparable scale, frequency, and complexity against prepared defenses. The island-hopping campaign that Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur jointly executed across the Pacific between 1942 and 1945 represented one of the most sophisticated applications of combined arms warfare in military history. The campaign did not follow the brute force path of attacking every Japanese-held island in sequence. Instead, American planners identified the critical nodes in Japan's island defense network, the airfields, the harbors, the supply depots, and bypassed the islands that didn't matter, leaving their garrisons isolated and irrelevant. Tarawa, Saipan, Palaleu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Each name represents not just a battle, but a demonstration of American military capability, advancing in complexity and ferocity. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, 3 Marine divisions assaulted an island that Japan's commander had spent months fortifying with 1,500 pillboxes, 16 miles of tunnels, and a garrison ordered to inflict maximum casualties and never surrender. The battle lasted 36 days. Nearly 7,000 Americans died. But the island fell, and the B-29 bases it provided allowed American strategic bombers to operate within 700 miles of the Japanese home islands, enabling the incendiary bombing campaign that destroyed more than 60 Japanese cities before the atomic bombs were used. The Pacific Campaign consumed more American naval power, more ammunition, more aviation fuel, and more industrial output than the European theater in several critical categories, and it was conducted simultaneously with the liberation of Europe. No other nation in history has successfully prosecuted 2 major theater wars simultaneously across 2 hemispheres. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany deserves its own examination, not because it was without controversy, but because its effects on the German war machine were decisive in ways that were not fully understood until after the war. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the German surrender using German industrial records, production data, and direct testimony from German industrial and military leaders, produced findings that changed the understanding of what strategic bombing had actually accomplished. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister and the organizational genius who had doubled German war production between 1942 and 1944, despite sustained Allied bombing, told American interrogators after his capture that 2 targets had most severely damaged German war production. The first was the campaign against synthetic oil production that began in May 1944. By September 1944, German synthetic oil output had fallen by 90%. German aircraft that were built could not be flown because there was no aviation fuel to power them. German tanks that reached the front lines ran out of fuel within days. The Wehrmacht's operational mobility, the characteristic that had made German blitzkrieg so devastating in 1939 and 1940, was destroyed not by superior firepower, but by the systematic destruction of the fuel that powered it. The second target Speer identified was the German transportation network. The campaign against German rail yards, bridges, and marshalling facilities that began in late 1944 shattered the logistical system that moved raw materials to factories and finished weapons to the front. By early 1945, German factories were still producing, but they could not distribute what they built. Tanks sat in rail yards, unable to reach units that were being destroyed by Allied forces. The strategic bombing campaign did not win the war alone, but it created the conditions under which the war could be won by degrading German operational capability faster than it could be replaced. The psychological dimension of American military power in the Second World War is perhaps the least quantifiable, but among the most strategically significant. The United States entered the war in December 1941 as a nation that had spent 2 decades retreating from international engagement, wounded by the losses of the First World War, exhausted by the Great Depression, profoundly reluctant to commit its young men to another European catastrophe. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, that reluctance was replaced by something that the Axis powers had not factored into their strategic calculations: a unified national will of extraordinary intensity. American public opinion did not fracture under the strain of wartime sacrifice. It hardened. War bond drives raised $186 billion from voluntary contributions. Rationing of food, fuel, rubber, and metals was accepted by the civilian population without serious organized resistance. Families with sons at the front displayed service flags in their windows. blue stars for those serving, gold stars for those killed. The Gold Star mothers who received those flags did not turn against the war. They demanded that the sacrifice their sons had made be justified by victory. This psychological dimension, the national cohesion of a democracy under existential threat, was something that neither Germany nor Japan had fully anticipated. German strategic planning had assumed that American public opinion would fragment under sustained casualties, that political opposition would force a negotiated settlement before American industrial power could be fully deployed. They were completely wrong. The democratic political system that Axis propagandists portrayed as weak, divided, and incapable of sustaining military commitment proved to be more durable, more resilient, and more capable of mobilizing national will than any authoritarian system it faced. The Lend-Lease program, often overlooked in American popular memory of the Second World War, was itself a demonstration of military power of a different kind, the power to sustain allies at the moment of their greatest weakness. Between March 1941 and September 1945, the United States transferred $50.1 billion worth of war materials to its allies, equivalent to approximately $800 billion in 2024 values. Great Britain received $31.4 billion worth of equipment, food, and raw materials, including 5,000 tanks, 7,000 aircraft, 400,000 trucks, and 23 million tons of food that prevented starvation in a nation that could not feed itself from its own agricultural production, while its merchant fleet was being destroyed by U-boats. The Soviet Union received $11.3 billion worth of Lend-Lease materials, including 7,056 tanks, 14,795 aircraft, 375,883 trucks, 35,170 motorcycles, and nearly 5 million tons of food. Soviet military historians have argued about the extent of Lend-Lease's contribution to Soviet victory on the Eastern Front for political reasons that are understandable in the Cold War context, but the military facts are unambiguous. The trucks that moved Soviet armies across the steppes of Ukraine in the Great Offensive Operations of 1943, 1944, and 1945 were largely American. The communications equipment that allowed Soviet commanders to coordinate those operations was largely American. The food that sustained Soviet soldiers through the brutal winters of the Eastern Front was partially American. Lend-Lease did not win the Eastern Front for the Soviet Union, but it accelerated Soviet operations, reduced Soviet casualties, and shortened the war by a margin that military historians still debate but universally acknowledge was significant. The role of American code breaking and signals intelligence in the Second World War represents a dimension of military power that operated entirely outside the public view during the conflict itself, and whose contribution to final victory was among the most decisive of any single program. The breaking of the Japanese Naval Code, designated JN-25 by American cryptine lists, gave Admiral Nimitz advance knowledge of Japanese operational plans that transformed what might have been a series of disasters into a series of decisive American victories. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, widely recognized as the turning point of the Pacific War, was won in large part because American intelligence had decoded the Japanese operational plans sufficiently to allow Nimitz to position his 3 remaining fleet carriers exactly where they needed to be to ambush the Japanese striking force. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day at Midway, the same 4 that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The Japanese Naval Aviation Force, built over decades with extraordinary investment in pilot training and aircraft development, was functionally destroyed at Midway in a battle that lasted less than 6 minutes for the decisive dive bomber attacks. In the Atlantic, the British breaking of the German Enigma Code to which American cryptanalysts contributed significantly and which American naval resources helped enable by capturing German U-boats with their Enigma machines, allowed Allied convoy routing to avoid the wolf packs that had been destroying merchant shipping at unsustainable rates. The Enigma intelligence program alone has been credited by some historians with shortening the Atlantic campaign by 2 years. Intelligence's power and American intelligence capability in the Second World War was a multiplier that amplified the effects of every other dimension of American military strength. The Manhattan Project, the American program that developed the atomic bomb, represents the ultimate expression of what American industrial, scientific, and organizational power was capable of achieving under conditions of supreme urgency and absolute priority. When President Roosevelt authorized the Manhattan Project in 1942, the theoretical physics required to build a nuclear weapon was understood by fewer than 1,000 scientists in the world. The engineering required to translate that theoretical understanding into a functional weapon had never been attempted. The industrial infrastructure required to produce the fissile material, enriched uranium and plutonium, did not exist anywhere on Earth. The entire program had to be created from nothing, in secret, under wartime conditions, with a deadline measured not in years but in the time it might take Germany or Japan to develop a similar weapon first. The scale of what was built is staggering. The Oak Ridge facility in Tennessee, built to produce enriched uranium, covered 60,000 acres and employed 82,000 workers at its peak. Workers who were told they were contributing to the war effort, but were not told what they were building. The Hanford site in Washington state, built to produce plutonium, required the construction of 9 nuclear reactors and covered 586 square miles. The Los Alamos laboratory in New Mexico, where the actual weapon design was developed under J. Robert Oppenheimer, assembled the most extraordinary concentration of scientific talent in history, including dozens of the world's leading physicists, many of them European refugees who had fled the Nazi regime. The total cost of the Manhattan Project was approximately $2 billion in 1945 values, equivalent to roughly $35 billion today. It was the largest single expenditure in the history of the United States government up to that point, and it succeeded. In July 1945, the Trinity Test in the New Mexico desert produced a nuclear explosion equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. In August 1945, the weapons built by the Manhattan Project were used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, producing casualties of approximately 130,000 people killed and forcing Japan's unconditional surrender within days. The American medical and logistical support system that sustained 16 million military personnel across 2 hemispheres for 4 years was itself a military achievement of the first order, one that is almost never discussed in popular accounts of the war, but that had profound effects on American combat power. The ratio of American wounded who survived their wounds improved dramatically across the war, from approximately 4% killed among those who reached medical care in earlier conflicts to less than 2% in the Second World War. This improvement came from a combination of advances: the introduction of penicillin, which eliminated the bacterial infections that had killed more soldiers than combat in previous wars, the development of blood plasma and whole blood transfusion at the forward surgical level, and the organizational innovation of battalion aid stations, clearing companies, and evacuation hospitals that moved wounded men through a tiered medical system within hours of injury. Sulfa drugs, previously unavailable in military quantities, were packaged in individual first aid kits carried by every American soldier. A wounded man who would have died of infection in the First World War survived his wound in the Second and often returned to combat. This was not just humanitarian, it was strategic. Every soldier saved by the medical system was a trained experienced fighter who did not need to be replaced from the United States. And replacement of trained soldiers was the American military's most persistent problem, because no production line could build a combat-experienced infantryman. The medical system that kept them alive was as much a weapon of war as the M1 rifle or the Sherman tank. The air campaign against Japan differed fundamentally from the campaign against Germany, not in its industrial logic but in its operational character. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the XX Bomber Command in the Pacific, recognized in early 1945 that the precision bombing doctrine developed for European operations was not producing results against Japan. Japanese industry was geographically dispersed, built largely of wood and paper construction materials, and concentrated in urban areas that were fundamentally different in character from German industrial cities. LeMay made a decision that remains controversial to this day. He abandoned precision bombing of specific industrial targets and adopted area incendiary bombing of Japanese urban areas. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1,945 325 B-29s struck Tokyo with incendiary bombs, creating a firestorm that killed between 80,000 and 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. By the end of the war, American incendiary bombing had destroyed more than 60 Japanese cities, killed between 241,000 and 900,000 civilians, estimates vary widely, and reduced Japanese industrial output by 60%. Japan's ability to resist an American invasion was being systematically eliminated, not just by destroying specific factories, but by destroying the urban infrastructure that Japanese industrial workers lived in. The moral questions raised by this campaign have been debated by historians and ethicists for 8 decades. The strategic questions are less ambiguous. By August 1945, Japan's ability to sustain organized military resistance was collapsing under the combined weight of naval blockade, strategic bombing, and the approaching threat of Soviet entry into the Pacific War. The atomic bombs delivered the final blow, but the war machine that made those bombs possible, and the industrial system that had been destroying Japanese cities for 6 months before they were used, had already made Japanese defeat inevitable. The naval supremacy that the United States achieved in the Pacific by 1944 and 1945 was so complete that it ceased to resemble a contest between comparable forces and began to resemble something closer to a training exercise conducted against token resistance. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, which American carrier aviators called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, illustrated this disparity with brutal clarity. Japan committed 9 fleet carriers, 430 aircraft, and the bulk of its remaining naval aviation to what it hoped would be a decisive engagement that would halt the American advance toward the Japanese home islands. The United States committed 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, and 956 aircraft. In 2 days of aerial combat, Japanese naval aviation lost 476 aircraft and 3 fleet carriers. American losses were 130 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents rather than enemy fire. The Japanese naval aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor with years of training and accumulated combat experience were dead or wounded. Their replacements had been trained in months rather than years, and they flew against American pilots who had been fighting and surviving since Midway. The technological gap was equally stark. American radar, American Combat Information Centers coordinating defensive fighter direction, American aircraft with superior performance in several key parameters, and American pilots with superior training and combat experience combined to produce a result that was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a destruction. By the end of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan had effectively ceased to exist as a carrier aviation power. What remained was a surface fleet that was running out of fuel, a submarine force that was being systematically destroyed by American anti-submarine warfare, and the desperate innovation of the kamikaze, pilots who chose certain death because the mathematics of conventional combat had become completely hopeless. The kamikaze program, Japan's decision to use pilots as guided missiles against American warships, represents one of the most psychologically significant confrontations of the entire war, and the American military's response to it demonstrated a kind of organizational and psychological resilience that was as important as its industrial output. The kamikaze was not an irrational response to an impossible situation. It was a rational calculation. A kamikaze mission had a far higher probability of causing serious damage to an American warship than a conventional, attacked by a pilot who lacked the training to survive anti-aircraft fire and American fighter interception. Between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,800 kamikaze missions were flown against American naval forces. They sank 47 ships and damaged 368 others, including damage to aircraft carriers of sufficient severity to require withdrawal from combat for repairs. They killed nearly 5,000 American sailors. This was real, measurable damage. But it was not enough. The American shipbuilding industry replaced the losses. The crews that survived attacks continued to fight. The medical system that had been built to sustain the combat power of the Army was equally effective for the Navy. And the psychological effect that Japanese planners had hoped for, the collapse of American will to continue advancing toward Japan, did not materialize. American naval commanders at Okinawa endured the most sustained kamikaze assault of the war, 1,465 kamikaze attacks in 82 days, suffering serious damage to hundreds of ships, and they continued the battle. They did not retreat. They did not negotiate. They continued to advance. Because the military system that had been built by American industry and American workers and American soldiers and sailors and Marines had developed an institutional momentum that individual acts of extraordinary sacrifice, however devastating in the moment, could not stop. The victory in Europe came first on May 8, 1945. When Germany signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, and it came as the result of a convergence of American military power with Soviet military power and British military power, and the resistance movements of occupied Europe that had sustained the fight against Nazi Germany from within. The American contribution to that convergence was decisive in several critical dimensions. The liberation of Western Europe from the beaches of Normandy to the Rhine River to the Elbe was accomplished primarily by American forces, more than 3 million American soldiers who fought from D-Day on June 6, 1944, through the final German collapse in April 1945. The air campaign that preceded and supported that ground advance had destroyed the Luftwaffe, shattered German transportation networks, and eliminated German oil production. The naval forces that had won the Battle of the Atlantic made the supply of those ground forces possible, and the American industrial system that had been running at maximum output for 3 years had ensured that American forces were the best equipped, best supplied, and most mechanically mobile ground forces in the history of warfare. American divisions advancing through France in the summer of 1944 were supported by a logistics system that was moving approximately 700,000 tons of supplies per month from English ports across the English Channel through improvised logistics networks to combat units fighting 400 miles from their supply bases. No army in the history of warfare had ever sustained that level of logistical support at that distance from its bases. The German Wehrmacht, which had pioneered mechanized warfare in 1939, was by 1944 fighting a war in which the majority of its combat units still relied on horse-drawn transport. They were fighting with horses against an enemy with 2.4 million military trucks. The global context of American military power in the Second World War cannot be fully understood without examining what the United States chose to build after the war, because the military infrastructure created between 1941 and 1945 did not disappear with the German and Japanese surrenders. It was transformed. The Manhattan Project's technology became the foundation of the American nuclear arsenal that defined the Cold War for the next 5 decades. The Carrier Task Force doctrine developed in the Pacific became the template for American naval power projection that exists to the present day. The logistics systems, the command and control architectures, the Joint Operations Doctrine that integrated Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Forces into a single coherent military instrument, all of it survived the war and became the institutional foundation of the most powerful military the world has ever seen. The 16 million Americans who served in uniform between 1941 and 1945 returned home carrying with them the organizational knowledge, the technical training, and the institutional confidence of the men and women who had built and operated the most powerful military machine in human history. They went to work in American corporations, American universities, American government agencies. They applied the organizational principles and the engineering knowledge they had developed during the war to the construction of the American post-war economy. And they built it with the same systematic, large-scale, production-oriented approach that had built the weapons that ended the Second World War. The war mission and the peacetime economy that produced were not separate phenomena. They were the same people operating the same systems, directed toward a different purpose. The legacy of American military power in the Second World War is not measured only in the weapons built and the battles won. It is measured in the strategic consequences of what was built, consequences that shaped the entire second half of the 20th century and continue to shape the world of the 21st. The United States emerged from the Second World War as the dominant military power on Earth by a margin so vast that it had no historical precedent. It possessed the only nuclear weapons in existence. It possessed the largest and most capable navy ever assembled. Its air forces outnumbered the air forces of every other nation combined. Its industrial output exceeded the combined output of all other industrial economies. And, uniquely among the major powers, it had suffered none of the physical destruction that had reduced Europe and Asia to rubble. American cities were intact. American factories were running. American agricultural output had actually increased during the war years. The economic foundations of American global power were not merely undamaged, they had been massively expanded by the war itself. This was the military and economic context in which the Cold War began, and it was a context that the Soviet Union, for all its military power and territorial acquisitions, could never overcome. The nuclear arsenal that Stalin raced to build, the conventional military forces that the Soviet Union maintained at enormous cost across the Cold War decades, the economic investments that the communist system could never sustain simultaneously with military competition, all of it was a response to the military and industrial power that the United States had demonstrated between 1941 and 1945. The Second World War created the American century not because America chose to dominate the world, but because America built a machine so powerful, so productive, and so organizationally sophisticated that nothing else in the world could match it. What the American war machine of the Second World War ultimately reveals when examined across all its dimensions, from the factories of Detroit to the beaches of Normandy, from the carrier decks of the Pacific to the ruins of Hiroshima, is not simply that the United States won the war. Many countries win wars. What the American experience between 1941 and 1945 reveals is something categorically different. The capacity of a democratic industrial society, when given sufficient cause and sufficient clarity of purpose, to mobilize human and material resources at a scale and with an efficiency that authoritarian systems, for all their apparent advantages of centralized control and ideological uniformity fundamentally cannot match. The German war economy, centrally directed by Albert Speer with the absolute authority of the Nazi state behind him, achieved remarkable outputs under extraordinary pressures, but it could not approach American production levels because it could not mobilize its civilian population, its industrial workforce, or its scientific establishment with the same organizational freedom that the American system provided. The Japanese war economy, sustained by an imperial ideology that demanded sacrifice unto death, collapsed under the weight of American naval blockade and aerial bombardment because it lacked the geographic depth, the resource base, and the industrial infrastructure that the American continent provided. What won the Second World War for the United States was not any single weapon, any single battle, or any single commander. It was a system of vast integrated self-reinforcing system of industrial production, technological innovation, logistical sophistication, and human organization that operated at a scale and with a complexity that no adversary could match, and no historian has fully encompassed in a single account. This is what power looks like when a democracy decides to fight. This is what happens when the most productive economy in the history of the world is directed, completely and without reservation, toward a single military purpose. And the world has never been the same since. The men who flew the B-17s over Regensburg and Schweinfurt, who knew statistically that they would not survive their 25 required missions, and flew anyway. The Marines who crossed the reef at Tarawa under fire that killed half their landing force in the first wave and kept moving toward the beach. The factory workers in Michigan and Ohio and California who worked double shifts for 4 years and sent their sons to use what they built. The women who built the bombers and the Liberty ships and the artillery shells. The scientists at Los Alamos who understood exactly what they were building and built it anyway because the alternative was unthinkable. All of them, every one of them, were components of the same machine. A machine built not by any single genius or any single leader, but by an entire civilization that decided, in December 1941, that it would not lose. That machine won. It won in the air over Germany. It won on the beaches of the Pacific. It won in the Atlantic. It won in the factories. It won because it was bigger, faster, more productive, more technically sophisticated, and more organizationally capable than anything its adversaries could build. And it won because the people who built it and operated it refused, at every moment and in every circumstance, to stop. If this is the kind of content that changes how you see the world, that shows you not just what happened in history, but why it happened and what it cost, then Battlefield Insight was built for you. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, because the story of how power is built, how it is used, and what it costs is a story that never ends, and we have only just begun to tell it.